إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما. أما بعد, we start in the name of Allah the Most High, the one to whom belongs all praise, the one who controls all affairs, the one who gives, the one who takes, glorified and exalted is He. And we send peace and blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his family and his followers until the end of time. Ameen. I want to talk a little bit today about one verse from the Quran and one of the angles of how we can understand it based on one of the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And inshallah, we'll try to take some benefit from it. The verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَوْلَا دَفْعُ اللَّهِ النَّاسِ بَعْضُهُمْ بِبَعْضٍ لَفَسَدَتِ الْأَرْضُ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ ذُو فَضْلٍ عَلَى الْعَالَمِينَ. He says subhanahu wa ta'ala, if it was not for Allah pushing and repelling some people by others, there would be great corruption in the earth, but Allah is full of bounty towards all of creation. And so really in this verse you have one of the sunan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the creation. One of the rules or ways of Allah that He has put in the way that He created everything, which is this idea of entities, whether on a micro level or on a macro level, pushing back on one another. And so you have on a greater political level, you have a certain power and another power, and kind of how they will counterbalance one another and keep each other in check at some level. And you have that on communal levels, you have that in families, you have all over the place you see the same idea. It's the idea that part of how we actually engage with one another and part of how we build community, part of how we deal with the realities of human existence is in this tension. And that's a very, very important principle to understand and to accept, is that what this verse is saying is that there will always be tension there. There will always be that which is calling towards good, and there will always be that which is calling towards evil. There will always be righteous and strong and amazing people, and there will always be people who are doing other types of things. There will always be people who are extremely generous with their wealth, and there will be others who are less generous. And that tension that exists between those things is part of the way that Allah created life. And that good is the good that the people who are good do, it's what actually prevents the bad from getting out of control. So Allah is saying, if it wasn't for this way that He built things, then there would be all kinds of corruption on the earth. And one of the ways that that plays out on a communal level is in the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which will really focus on just the end of it, where he said sallallahu alaihi wasallam, ad-dinu nasiha, that the entirety, really the expression here is uslub al-qasr. It means that the entirety of the religion is embodied in the sincere advice and counsel that people give to one another, or that we give in different ways. Why I say that is because sometimes we translate nasiha into advice and it kind of cancels most of the hadith actually. And so we have to kind of think about what the word means. And nasiha comes from the idea, images oftentimes, at least in my perspective, are very helpful in understanding the true reality of a term. Because when we use words, we're not just using they're not just lines on paper, right? They're conjuring up entire atmospheres of meaning. And to really get a feel for that meaning helps us to get a better understanding of what we're trying to get at. And so when we say nasiha, one of the roots of this in the Arabic language comes from the idea of taking a needle and threading a thread through the eye of the needle. Or taking the thread and putting it through the eye of the needle. This is what nusх is. To give this, that's why sometimes you translate it as sincere advice or sincere counsel. Because look at the beginning of the hadith. It's nasiha. We said to who, Ya Rasulullah? He said to Allah and His book and His messenger and the leaders of the Muslims and the general population of the Muslims. So if the word means advice, we can't give just advice. We can't give advice to the book of Allah. That doesn't make any sense, right? We can't give advice to Allah Himself. But we can give nasiha in the sense of we live our lives in relation to those things like you would thread the needle. So I care enough about my relationship with God, and I care enough about my relationship with Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or with the Book of Allah, that I'm going to treat those things like I would treat the needle when I'm trying to put the thread through it. And the same thing then carries over to how I engage with the leadership of the Muslims. أئمتهم لله ولرسول لكتابه ولرسوله ولأئمة المسلمين وعامتهم. And to the leaders of the Muslims also. I'm not trying to break the needle. I'm not trying to throw it away. I'm not trying to disregard it or get rid of it. I just want to get the thread in the right place. And also when it comes to the relationships then between the general population of the Muslims, how we treat each other. And so that's the one that I really want to put emphasis on. Because, we have to recognize that there are greater cultural consequences to the environments that we live in. One of the greater cultural consequences of the environment that we live in is that it's extremely individualistic. And overall, although Islam does have rights for the individual and does care for the individual and so on and so on and so on, Islam is very collectivist. There is an idea and an understanding of the community, of the people. And insofar as we're not able to give one another sincere counsel, we cannot have community. And we need that with one another because that's what pushes, it's that pushing on one another. Right? Yeah, I could go and I could just live my life in some isolated place and not deal with anybody. But then am I really going to get the pushback that I need to overcome certain issues of arrogance or problems with humility or misunderstandings that I might have or any other type of things? We actually need each other for that. And so this hadith is really pushing us towards this conceptualization of a community of people who are agreeing on certain principles with one another. In order for this hadith to be to manifest itself, there have to be certain principles that we agree upon. So we're agreeing upon, for example, coming together, that Allah and His Messenger are the paramount issues in our lives. Otherwise, there's no way we can give advice to each other. How are we going to have sincere counsel if there's not a markaziyya, if there's not some anchor that holds all of that together? So this is one of the agreements that we have. It's an unwritten agreement in a sense. Another one is that we're not perfect. And we don't expect each other to be perfect. And we recognize that I'm going to make mistakes and you're going to make mistakes and all of us are going to have shortcomings and difficulties, and we're going to be sincere and care enough about one another to give each other that advice when it's the time to give it. That's also part of the unwritten understanding of what's going on in this hadith. So that then means that we're pushing towards the religion is advice to one another, sincere counsel to one another in the last part of the hadith. So what are some of the guidelines for that? And in the rest of the khutbah, I just want to give 5 particular guidelines for the person who's giving advice, and then 3 for the person who's receiving it. Okay, they'll be easier to remember than it sounds. For the person who's giving the advice, rule number 1, make sure that you understand the situation properly. Okay, rule number 1, make sure that you understand the situation properly. I'm sure all of us have had experiences where we're on the receiving end of a piece of advice that wasn't actually in the right place. Like someone just, they saw something and they thought it was a particular way, or they heard something and they thought it meant a particular thing, and now I'm going to give you this advice. So number 1 then is to make sure that it's understood correctly. Did I actually understand what the person is saying that I'm taking issue with? Did I actually understand their action and to mean what it actually was, or so on and so forth? Because this happens a lot, right? Number 1 and number 2 are really, they're kind of like the big ones, the preventative issues. So number 1 is to understand the situation. Number 2 is to assess and recognize whether or not that's something that actually needs to be corrected. So assuming now that we understood the situation, the second question comes. Is this something that actually needs to be corrected? And the principle in Islamic law is لا إنكار في مسائل الاجتهاد, that you cannot rebuke somebody in an area of dispute. Meaning, if, say for example, first of all, you're not correcting it. You don't have to correct it unless it's haram. This is first principle. If it's disliked and you're really close with the person or whatever, maybe you can talk to them. But if it's not haram, it's probably not the time to go and correct the person, right? So first question is it actually not allowed in the religion? Then number two is it universally not allowed? So this is what I mean by understanding what the actual ruling is, right? Because you might have one school, I'll give you a very common one. And we have schools of interpretation in Islamic thought for a reason. It's not because they're trying to ignore the Quran and Sunnah. You hear that sometimes. But brother, you tell someone, well, there's a couple of different opinions on it. They say, what do we have opinions for? The hadith says this. Okay, Imam Ahmad's Musnad has 30,000 hadith in it. I mean, are we really getting into this conversation right now that the hadith says this and the hadith says that? As if like Abu Hanifa and Malik and Shafi'i and Ahmad ibn Hanbal, they didn't care about the hadith? A'udhu billah. They all cared about the hadith. The question is, how do they interpret it? And the Prophet ﷺ lays out very early in his message that there are times when there will be multiple interpretations, and that's okay, within a certain framework and with certain limits. So you have, for example, sometimes on Jummah, I've had this happen to me before. I don't read Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim out loud in Surah Al-Fatiha. I read it, but not out loud, because that's the Hanafi position. The Maliki position, you don't read the Basmala. The Shafi'i position, you have to read the Basmala. These are pretty serious differences, right? You have to read Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim in the Shafi'i school. In the Maliki school, you don't read it. So now, if I don't read it, should someone come and correct me over that? No, this is not something that you would correct someone over, because there's valid difference of opinion on it. So the second rule then, number one, understand the situation. Number two, understand whether or not that thing that you're correcting actually needs to be corrected. This is number two. That's why a lot of, actually, historically, they would talk about the right to correct things is most, if you're really going to correct. General advice is general advice. But if you're really going to correct, oftentimes they would say that's the prerogative of the ulama. That's the prerogative of the people of knowledge. Why? Because they're the only ones that know all the details of the positions. There's things that I've seen people do in the masajid that I'm not familiar with. I've never read it anywhere in a number of years of studying fiqh. Never read it. But I haven't researched that particular issue to know if that position exists or not. So I don't say anything to them. This is not unless I actually know, I don't have the right. So this is point number two. Point number three is assess the level of relationship you have with the person. So we've said it before, we'll say it again. The principle here is connect before you correct. Connect before you correct. In social justice circles and stuff, they'll talk about the idea of intention versus impact. Right? You might have a great intention. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to land the way that you want it to land. Right? And yes, they should take the advice and so on. Your job is not to critique them. Your job is to critique yourself. Am I giving the advice properly? So I have to assess, am I doing this in a way that it's going to land how I want it to land? Right? What is my relationship with this person? Have I ever seen them before? Have I ever spoken to them before? Do I know what's going on with them in their life? Any of these type of things, really basic things. Right? Because sometimes that's what happens in our community spaces, is we get really, we have to protect this thing that we understand to be Islam. And it doesn't matter if I've never seen this person before. It doesn't matter if they're exhibiting outward behaviors that seem like they're not doing well. And I should probably ask them how they're doing and get to know them and so on and so forth. It doesn't matter. I just have to correct them. And that's a mistake. This is point number three, is to assess the relationship. People can move in as much as possible to make space. Jazakallah khair. I know there's not much, but yafsahillahu lakum, inshallah. So that's number three. Number four is extremely important. Get your emotions out of it. Get your emotions out of it. The idea is to give sincere counsel to somebody. It's not to destroy them. It's not to get it off of your chest. It's not to just not have to think about it anymore. It's not any of those reasons. It's to actually help the person. You imagine trying to thread the needle by just jamming it at the needle over and over and over again? You're probably not going to get the thread through the eye of the needle. And if you do, the thread's going to be so messed up afterwards, it might even split in different ways. Like now the thread became 3 parts. You can't get anything through the needle because you're jamming it, right? So have to get the emotions out of it. And this is a really tough one, right? But it's a pretty basic thing. Like if I'm going to give sincere counsel to somebody else, like I have to be able to control myself long enough to actually put them ahead of me. That's the idea here, is that I'm putting the other person ahead of myself, right? So I'm not going to go and yell at them. I'm not going to just unload everything that I have. I have to control all of that. And number 5 is to do it in private. To do it in private. Now, as always, hard cases make bad law. Sometimes there's cases where you cannot do it in private. Sometimes, like if someone was to stand up, la qadr Allah, if someone was to stand up right now and smack someone else in the back of the head in the middle of the Jummah, you can't be like, oh wait, I need to only tell him once we're in private, I let him know that wasn't acceptable. So no. Like now you kind of have to give public advice to the person. Like you have to stop, right? But there are exceptions. There are people who are in public positions, for example, and they betray that trust. These are all exceptional cases. But the general rule for advice is that النصيحة في العامة فضيحة. That to give someone advice in public is scandalous. It's not the right thing to do. It's just embarrassing, makes it more difficult for them to accept it, and so on. So these are the 5. Number 1, again to review. Number 1 is to understand the situation properly. Number 2 is to know whether or not this issue needs to be corrected. Number 3 is to assess our relationship with the person. Number 4 is to get our emotions out of it. And number 5 is to do it in private. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد عباد الله أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله. I remind myself and everyone to have God consciousness in all affairs. So those are the 5 for the person who's giving advice. Now again we have 3 for the person who's receiving it. And I'm sure most of us can agree it's generally a battle to receive advice. It's some people, mashallah, they're really good and it's easy for them to receive advice. Some people are not doing so well and you cannot tell them anything. No matter how hard you try, no matter if you fulfill all of the rules, that's a bad place to be in. Just to look at ourselves and ask ourselves, like, am I the kind of person nobody can tell me anything? Even if they did it right, even if they approached me nicely and privately and they considered whether or not they should, and they did all of these things and they still can't talk to me, it's probably some things we need to work through internally. So what are the 3 then for the person who's receiving? Number 1 is to recognize that it's going to happen. So number 1 is we have to just prepare ourselves mentally and spiritually to be the kind of person that will receive advice. So it's tied to what I was just saying. I need to make the recognition in myself that I want to be the kind of person that when my brother or sister in faith approaches me and corrects me about something, I'm going to try to take it. Right? So that is something that we have to internally acknowledge and accept. So this is number 1. Number 2 is to try to put around ourselves and keep around ourselves people who will do that. And this is really a very challenging thing, but that's what brotherhood and sisterhood really is. There's a common kind of popular understanding of what friendship means, which is basically don't say anything to your friend about any position that they have on anything ever. That's not friendship. That's like, let's hold our hands and walk into hellfire together. That's not actually what we're looking for. What we're looking for is relationships where people will actually talk to us. And they'll tell us like, you know what? You came off a little bit too hard today. Are you all right? Or, you know what, that thing that you said, it's not entirely true. It seems like you answered that question before you really understood what they were asking. Like, we need those kind of things in our lives. Otherwise, we're going to be in trouble. And so then the second step then is to consciously try to do that. To let the people that are close to us know that you want their advice, that you want their feedback, And then, of course, to try to accept it, as we said in number 1. Number 3, and the final point, and this one really is the most challenging, but, it's just the truth, is that so now we're on the receiving end. Oftentimes, when we mix up our understandings of things in Islam, it's because al-jiha ghayr munfakka, like we didn't actually manage to put things in their right place. So what happens is I'm on the receiving end, and I'm worried about whether or not the person who's giving the advice is giving it properly. And that's really not the point. That's for them to worry about. And the one who's giving the advice is worrying about whether or not the one who's receiving it is receiving it properly. And that's not really the point either, because that's not their problem. Right? So my problem as the person or my issue as the person who's receiving the advice is, very simply, is there truth in it? Right? So it can come like in the worst. Imam al-Ghazali says one of the ways for the person to know the defects of themselves is to listen to their enemies. It's a really amazing thing. He lists out multiple things, but he says one of them is to listen to your enemy. Why? Because your enemy is going to find any slightest problem they can find with you, they're going to find it. And if you're really serious about trying to figure out, like, am I the way that I am? What do I need to improve on? Then, it might be worth considering. Doesn't mean you have to let it stay with you all the time and bring you down and all that kind of stuff. But at least consider it. So the person comes however they come. Angry, upset, yelling, so on and so forth, whatever it might be. The core ideal that we would like to live up to is, is that true? Is there truth to what they're saying right now? Like, okay, all of this stuff out, but is it true that I did this wrong, or I did that wrong, or so on and so forth? That's the core question. This is a core question to focus on. And again, to recognize that we're going to make mistakes. There's a beautiful story I'll end with. I'll summarize the 3 and then I'll end with the story. The 3 again were, number 1, to be the kind of person that can receive advice. Number 2, to keep those kind of people around us that will give it to us. And number 3 is to ask whether or not there's any truth in it. Right? To really ask ourselves that. There's a beautiful story of Imam Zayn al-Abidin, Ali ibn Hussein radiallahu an, and that a man came to him and he was leaving the masjid. He's leaving the masjid, the man came to him and cursed him. And the people who were with him, around him, were like slaves and poor people and stuff, because that's who loved him, and that's who he loved. That's also part of the sunnah. And they went to, confront this person. He told them, leave the man alone. And he went to him and he said, what Allah has concealed from us is actually more. Okay, so what is he saying? The man comes to him and curses him. And he's telling him, actually what you don't know about us is worse than what you think you know. Right? That's what he's essentially telling him. What has been مَا سُتِرَ عَنَّا مِنْ أَمْرِنَا أَكْثَرُ. It's like what has been concealed of our affairs is actually more, it's worse. And then he told the man, أَلَكَ حَاجَةٌ نُعِينُكَ عَلَيْهَا. This is the response of the people of Allah. He said, what, my situation is actually worse than you think it is? Do you have anything I can help you with? Do you have anything I can help you with? Like, can I do a khidmah for you? Can I do some service for you? Can I help you with something that you need help with? This is a very elevated level of receiving whatever is coming to the person. We ask Allah to make us a community of those who sincerely counsel one another, and to make us people who are able to accept that counsel when we hear it. And we ask Allah to give food to those who are hungry. Ya Allah, give food to those who are hungry. Give shelter to those who are shelterless. Give victory to those who are oppressed. Give aid to those who are suffering in many places around the world, Ya Rabbil Alameen. O Allah, be with them and make their feet firm and make their hearts calm and eased, and give them beautiful endings, Ya Rabbil Alameen. Give them gifts in their oppression that they would not have been able to receive without it, Ya Allah. Allah, give them aid and give them perseverance and give them strength. We ask you, Ya Allah, to give us knowledge that benefits us and to benefit us from that which you have given us, Ya Rabbil Alameen. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وإسرافنا في أمرنا وثبت أقدامنا اللهم بارك فينا وبيننا وألف بين قلوبنا وصفوفنا اللهم كن معنا ولا تكن علينا وانصر إخواننا المستضعفين في كل مكان افتح عليهم يا فتاح يا عليم اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا صالحا اللهم بلغنا رمضان اللهم بلغنا رمضان اللهم بلغنا رمضان وصلى اللهم وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا وأقيموا الصلاة